Good morning and welcome. I'm Alex Vatanka. I'm the director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's event, US-Iran Talks and Implications for the Broader Middle East. The US and Iran continue to negotiate in Vienna. For over a month now, Iran and the US and the other powers have been seeking to salvage the 2015 nuclear deal, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, that the Trump administration withdrew from in May of 2018. Now, the Biden administration appears determined to revive the JCPOA. It also appears that the Iranian side, led by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, is also very much interested in a new deal. But what will a new deal look like? And is there any chance that a new US-Iran deal can be broadened to include other non-nuclear issues, such as Tehran's regional agenda and activities? Last time around, between the period of July 2015 and May of 2018, when a nuclear agreement was in place, Iran and the US did not seek or succeed in expanding the process of dialogue. Can it be different this time around if there is a new deal? Where else could we see an Iranian-American willingness to accommodate each other? Can, for example, the country of Iraq provide such an opportunity where Iran and US are the most important foreign players, but in a competition for influence, as we all know? Today, I'm pleased to welcome three experts who will discuss and help us understand these challenges and possible scenarios for us to keep in mind. First, we have former ambassador of Iraq to the United States, Ambassador Rend Al-Rahim. She's joining us today from Beirut in Lebanon. Thank you very much. Next, we have Michael Rubin, who is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Michael is joining us from Washington, D.C. area. Last but not least, we have Ali Vaez, who is the director of the Iran program at the International Crisis Group. And Ali is also joining us today from Washington. Just a few admin pointers before we start. To submit your questions, please use the Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find in your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. And important point, feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking at your questions and we'll factor in as many as possible into the discussion, which should last about an hour. Very much looking forward to it. Let me start off. I will start off with Ali, then I'll go to Michael, and then I come to the ambassador. Ali, what's the situation right now in Vienna? What are the negotiations looking like at the moment to you? And tell us, are you hopeful, not so hopeful, and why not, and so forth? Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alex, for the invitation. It's great to be on this panel and at MEI's virtual event. Look, this is the fifth round of negotiations that started back in April. My understanding is that the parties are now working off a joint draft, which I imagine has a lot of brackets in it. Some of those brackets would get resolved probably in this round. Some of them would have to be resolved at the 11th hour. That's usually the norm in negotiations between Iran and P5+1. The areas of disagreement, I think, are pretty clear to everyone. There are some sanctions, especially terrorism-related sanctions, that the Biden administration believes are not inconsistent with the JCPOA and wants to keep in place. And Iran is reluctant to take some technical steps of rolling back its nuclear program that would take into account the irreversible progress that Iran has made on research and development on advanced centrifuges. But at the end of the day, I don't believe any of these disagreements are insurmountable, and the alternatives to restoring the JCPOA are really not attractive for either side. So I feel either in this round or in the next round, they would be able to finalize a list of measures that each side would have to undertake to come back into full compliance. The next challenge would be to discuss the sequencing. As you know, the Iranians expect the US to go first for them to verify sanctions relief and only then start rolling back their nuclear program, which I don't think is workable for the Biden administration. But there is, I think, flexibility in figuring out a mutually acceptable formula. So my own sense, which has been my prediction since February, is that a roadmap for returning to the JCPOA is likely to get finalized right after the Iranian presidential elections, because the Iranian system does not want a diplomatic breakthrough in Vienna to have electoral implications back in Tehran. Then the implementation could still start under President Rouhani, and obviously he would get any of the blame of the shortcomings of the roadmap. But his successor, which now increasingly looks like his 2017 rival and the current judiciary chief, Ebrahim Raisi, will be the one who would reap the economic benefits once he comes to office.
Ali, before I get Michael's reaction to what's going on in Vienna, does anybody in Tehran seriously believe that this election on June 18th is going to have an impact one way or another on these talks? I mean, these are not really being okayed at the presidential palace level. I mean, Abbas Araghchi's best messenger, his boss Zarif, is keeping a very low profile. So, I mean, I just want to get this issue of the Iranian elections. Let's confront it head on. Does it really matter that much?
I would say it doesn't matter as much as of this week that it did last week or 2 weeks ago or a month ago. The reason is, the system would have a much easier time basically rigging the election to the extent that it has in this round, if there is a sense of doom and gloom within the society. I mean, remember that last year in the parliamentary elections, which resulted in a landslide victory for the hardliners and witnessed the lowest participation rate in the Islamic Republic's history, the outcome was exactly what the deep state desired. And I think they wanted to replicate that in this election to make sure that the election is a shoo-in for Mr. Raisi, who potentially is looking to even a higher office of succeeding Ayatollah Khamenei as the supreme leader. I think the result of disqualifications, which have shocked segments of the society, would have been even more shocking if there was a prospect of a diplomatic breakthrough and light at the end of a tunnel that Iran would be able to significantly de-escalate its tensions with the West. It doesn't matter as much now because that's done. It's already behind us. It's history. And so it is likely that the roadmap would get finalized, in the next few weeks, even on or prior or slightly after the presidential elections. But regardless, the schedule of events that I just described to you, the issues that remain to be negotiated and resolved would take as much time anyways.
Right. Thank you, Ali. I agree with everything. I mean, look, the one thing we should tell our audience, mostly a Washington, D.C. audience, is that, in this Iranian system, Ali Larijani, it's amazing to me that he was being sold as a reformer. The man has almost no credentials. I mean, at best, you could describe him as a Rouhani ally, but he's being sold as a reformer. To me, it's just, and the fact that Khamenei has the power to kind of issue a decree and he could still be in the election remains to be seen. But thank you, Ali. Let me turn to Michael. Michael, like with Ali, you've been following talks in Vienna. What do you make of it? Tell us about your hopes or pessimism. What do you stand on it?
Well, there's an old Russian joke about the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. The Russian pessimist is the one who says, things have never been so bad. I mean, war, tension, bad economy, they couldn't possibly get worse. And the Russian optimist is the one who said, no, they can always get worse. So in this talk, I'll be a little bit like a Russian optimist. At the same time, as you know, Alex, I'm a historian, so I get paid to predict the past. And most of my critics around DC would say I only get that right about 50% of the time, let alone looking towards the future. Ali, I don't know why you're smiling here. At any rate, Ali and I can debate about some of the intricacies of the deal further on in this program. But what I want to do is actually look at some of the broad picture of what concerns me. We can debate later on whether the deal is all that it's sold to be, whether the JCPOA was, and whether returning to it is wise. But what really concerns me, Alex, is some of the issues which were ignored in 2015, internal to Iran, and some of the issues that I am afraid are being ignored today. As you know, one of the formative events of the Islamic Republic was the Iran-Iraq War. And during that war, that was the time when the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps really coalesced and became elite within Iranian society. You've got a situation where at the end of the war, when Ayatollah Khomeini got up and he talked about drinking from that chalice of poison, but he had no choice but to drink from that cup if he wanted the revolution to survive, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps didn't simply want to go back into the barracks and subordinate themselves to the parliament. And so you had, without moral equivalence, their equivalent of the Army Corps of Engineers. And they decided to invest directly into the Iranian economy. Today, this idea of Khatam al-Anbiya, the economic wing of the Revolutionary Guards, the way for an American audience to understand it is combine the Army Corps of Engineers with KBR, Halliburton, Bechtel, Walmart, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, ExxonMobil, and SAIC. And the distortive effects of that are huge within Iran. What worries me, if we're not going to get caught into a cycle where every successive American administration walks away from the agreement because of partisan criticism, which even as a Republican, I would agree is horrible for America's diplomatic reputation. What I'm afraid of is if we have a deal like the JCPOA or any JCPOA version 2.0 that doesn't acknowledge the distortive effects of the Revolutionary Guard in Iran's economy, we can actually snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in terms of having a workable deal, because all of not only unfrozen assets and so forth, but all the investment which goes into the Iranian economy would disproportionately benefit not the people who need it most within Iran, but the Revolutionary Guard, and do so in a way that would allow them to act outside of the bounds of Iranian law and of parliamentary oversight. And this could actually augment and heighten the spoiler role that we have. Unfortunately, although not on this panel, in the Washington, D.C. debate, this whole subject has become so polemical and so superficial that we're not actually getting people from across Washington, economists, people from both sides of the aisle and so forth, together to try to figure out how to separate a deal from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' economic wing disproportionately benefiting. We can go in later on in the talk about what this might mean in terms of regional problems, in terms of even deal compliance, but let me leave it there as what I see one of the biggest unspoken weaknesses of the current process.
And I'd love to hear what Ali and Ambassador Rahim have to say about that. But let me quickly follow up, Michael, and sort of push back a little bit. If I understood you correctly, in terms of broadening, basically, the demands from the Iranian side, I mean, if you look at the 12, 13 points that Secretary Pompeo issued back in 2018, I mean, I don't know if they explicitly asked about, the Revolutionary Guards holding back or rolling back their economic interests, but there was a lot more that the Trump administration wanted to get out of those talks with the Iranians. And as we all know, the maximum pressure campaign didn't work. So what would you say to those people who say, yes, Michael, you're raising the right questions here, but the fact is the one thing we worry about more than anything else is that nuclear clock ticking in the background. That's the one we want to stop, and then we can get on with all the other issues. What do you say to them?
Well, first of all, Alex, what I would say not only to them, but to you would be this notion that everything has to be according to the timeline of the artificial American political calendar, that every strategy has to conform only to 4 years is itself problematic. Ali Alfona, for example, has written in the past about times when maximum pressure has worked. For example, what it took to release the hostages in 1979, what it took to end the Iran-Iraq war as well. That said, and this is something which I might agree with on Ambassador al-Rahim, Iraq was devastating and the impact of sanctions on Iraq were devastating. When the regime changed in Iraq, Iraq went from being an adversary to being an ally overnight. And yet 18 years on, we're still dealing with a problem of a dysfunctional economy in Iraq because of the way in which we addressed that economic pressure way back when. I think there's a lot of other strategies out there which could address the issue. And this is something which I can't remember whether we talked about, but one of my, I've done a lot of work for the US Navy before, We have all these and I've lived in Iran. And when I was in Iran, one of the things that really struck me most was the discord that Iranians have, especially veterans of the Iran-Iraq War and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, because of poor veteran services. Why not send one of our hospital ships to Dubai and offer free medical care for any Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps veteran? Either they accept it, which is a propaganda and intelligence coup for us, or they're not allowed to accept it, which increases dissension in the ranks. I do think that there's a lot of steps we can take short of this dichotomy between maximum pressure and flooding them with cash.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Let me turn to Ambassador Rahim. Ambassador, as you know better than me, since 1979, the American-Iranian competition for influence has overwhelmingly happened on Arab soil. And Iraq is probably top of the list. So from the Arab perspective, from Iraqi perspective, how important are these Iranian-American talks in Vienna, and what are the issues that you watch out for the most? You're muted, Ambassador. Ambassador, we can't hear you.
Back in the Bush administration, we sometimes would have wished for that.
There you are.
Sorry.
Now we can hear you. Yes,
Sorry.
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, Alex. I want to, before I sort of talk about what you've suggested, I wanted to address one point that came up, and that is, let's go back to the JCPOA as it is, pretty much, and then we can talk about other stuff, such as the Revolutionary Guard, etc., and so on. I don't think that there is a chance in heaven that once there's a return to the JCPOA as it is, that the US will be able to negotiate it out, to negotiate more elements to it. I think that's a bit of a pipe dream. Whatever has to be negotiated has to be negotiated now as a package. The Iranians will not be very receptive to the idea of let's do this bit and then we can extend. But I want to go back to some of the sort of issues that you first talked about, which is what is the US negotiating for, and how does that impact the region, and particularly Iraq? So I want to sort of go back and say that a lot of this, a lot of what we sort of think about really is dependent on how we understand Iran's long-term goals and strategy in the region, and I mean long-term, and how we understand what the US wants to achieve with Iran and with the region. And it's a truism that Iran thinks strategically and long-term, whereas the US tends to think in terms of shorter time frames. Now, it appears that within this administration, because so much happened under the Trump administration and so on, that there is a new thinking about the region, which sort of goes back a little bit to the Obama administration, but also picks up a bit from the Trump administration, which is that there should be a new regional order in the Middle East, and that the US should be less engaged on the ground and less preoccupied with the endless complexities and conflicts in the Middle East, that we need to pay attention elsewhere. And there comes a point when the Middle East has to look after itself. So we may be looking at a slightly longer term strategy, even within the US, to match the much longer strategy that Iran always engages in. Okay, but within this new thinking, if my analysis is correct, the US really does want to go back to the nuclear deal with Iran. And of course, Iran, for economic and all sorts of other reasons, wants to go back to the nuclear deal. How they do that, I think Ali has sort of mapped out a few steps in the near future. But I think eventually, whether before the elections or more likely after the elections, we will get some deal. The US may even negotiate for a somewhat stronger deal, one that has fewer sunset clauses, that extends deadlines and so on, and perhaps what I would call a JCPOA plus. The US may even want to address the ballistic missiles issue within the context of a full return to a JCPOA plus. Now, to what extent Iran has an appetite to negotiate on the ballistic issue, to extend the deadlines and so on, it's hard to tell. But essentially, this really all has to be done in the context of agreeing to a JCPOA plus at the start, not let's do JCPOA and then see what pieces we can add to it. Going to work. Now, the third piece that's often talked about is containing Iran's influence in the region. Mm-hmm. Okay. There's quite a bit of lip service paid to that, both in the Trump administration and under the Biden administration, by Jake Sullivan, by Blinken, and so on. But really, the rhetoric is not matched by any action or even preparation for action. And it strikes me that the US is less interested in seriously addressing Iran's power projection in the region. It would require too much investment from the US, political investment, diplomatic, even military and financial. And I don't know that the US is prepared to make that investment, neither now, nor if there is a JCPOA agreement, will it be able to, even if it wishes to, in the future. And I want to put another angle on it. It is possible that curtailing Iran's power projections may be sort of, it may be contrary to the way the US is thinking about the new Middle East. It may thwart the notions of a new Middle East order that the US holds. Iran's ambition in the region is to become the regional hegemon. There's no question about that. And it has succeeded in doing so in Iran, in Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, certainly, although that is, I think, in my view, less sensitive to Iran's strategic interests in Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. And Iran has invested a great deal since the 1980s, really, to embed itself, to implant itself in these countries, whether it's through Hezbollah or the Ba'ath Party in Syria, certainly after 2003 in Iraq with all its allies and proxies and so on. And it's embedded itself politically in terms of security arrangements, in the economy, certainly, in foreign policy decisions and so on. It sort of entangled itself in the fabric of the state and the state's ability to make decisions and policy in those three countries. And I think that Iran will find it very difficult if the US tries to curtail this influence. So as far as Iraq is concerned, if there is a return to JCPOA, certainly the tensions, the attacks on US interests by Iran's proxies, the militias, that will probably be pulled back. We've seen an escalation lately, but that's a form of pressure by Iran on the US on the nuclear deal. Mm-hmm. It's more about the nuclear deal rather than anything else. I think if there is a JCPOA deal, then that kind of pressure will ease. But it won't do anything for Iraq, because Iraq's problem, its essential problem, is the fact that Iran is so much in control of all these areas of economy, state, society, and so on. And a JCPOA that does not address Iranian influence in the region will not change anything in Iraq. So I want to sort of finally say, I want to speculate about what the US thinks of a new order. What if the US really wants to have less to do, have less investment in the region? What is a security structure that will allow the US to disentangle, to reduce its presence. We've already seen Israeli and Gulf country arrangements and normalization and security arrangements. But that leaves Iran. And to what extent, what role does the US see for Iran in a new security order in the Middle East? Is the US willing, in exchange for neutralizing Iran's nuclear capacity, perhaps its ballistic missiles, and therefore reducing or eliminating the threat to US allies in the region, is the US willing to give Iran a role, a sort of a sphere of influence in the region, which would include Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon? And then the Gulf Israeli security arrangements would take care of the rest of the region, at least in the Near East, where US allies are. Will the US think this is a good arrangement and worth bargaining over? And the question is, will it appease Iran in the long term? Does Iran only see itself as having control or hegemony over Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon? Or does Iran have wider ambitions in the region? This is really a very difficult question to answer. So essentially, we really need to think about how Iran thinks about the region, how Iran thinks about its power in the region, and how the US thinks about the region, and what the US is willing to concede to Iran in the region. If my speculation is correct, and that the US cannot and is not willing to contain Iran's influence in this sort of arc, the Levant, if you want, then really this will be a big initial plus for Iran. But in the long term, it'll be a big loss for Iraq. But I wonder if in the long term, it will satisfy Iran and it will really produce this security architecture that the US would like to see. I'll stop here.
Okay. Thank you. Ambassador, very quick answer, if I could get that from you, because Michael kind of hinted at it too, the issue of, US elections every 4 years. You can't have foreign policy within that time span. And you're talking about it, the United States doing short-term foreign policy versus adversaries or rivals like Iran that do long-term. You know the United States quite well. What do you think are the core drivers that leads to short-term foreign policy? I mean, this country did pursue a decade-long Cold War strategy. I mean, it's not that, or a war against terrorism and so on. So what is it that it's in the way today when it comes to a country like Iran or a future of US interest in the Middle East?
Yeah. I mean, if you go back to the Cold War, there was a much more formidable enemy with a very present danger, which was nuclear armed. And of course, one of the reasons that the US wants to go back to the JCPOA is precisely this nuclear thing, this nuclear issue, and neutralizing Iran from its nuclear capability and possibly its ballistic capability, because Iran would then become, if it is indeed an adversary, if it continues to be, then it is a manageable adversary, unlike what we had during the Cold War. But I'm trying to think about, I really do not see enough action as opposed to rhetoric on the US part to try and control Iran's influence in this region. Look, the US has essentially ceded Syria to Russia. And if Iran is controlled, or if Iran's influence in Syria is diminished, it won't be because of the US. It'll be because of Russia. And we have already seen Russia take steps to minimize or to sort of, shrink Iran's role, if you want. In Lebanon, the US apart from slapping sanctions on Hezbollah, really doesn't do very much in order to redress the balance that is now so heavily in favor of Hezbollah. So in those two countries, yes, the US may decry Iranian influence in Iran. It may decry, Hezbollah's influence or Iran's presence in Syria. But, apart from condemnation, there isn't anything that's being done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In Iraq, the US had unique opportunities. And, it would take too long to talk about them. But just look at the strategic dialogue. The Strategic Framework Agreement was signed, I believe, in 2008. It was moribund until earlier this year, last summer. And then we had two very superficial meetings with no follow-up whatsoever, no mechanisms for implementation, no vision for how to implement or what was important. Then we had another meeting in February, nothing between summer and February because of elections. We recently had another chit-chat between the Prime Minister and I believe Secretary Blinken. Anyway, the effort has been desultory, has been half-hearted. And yet the Strategic Framework Agreement is at the core of what the US can do in order to leverage the US as against other countries that have leverage already. This is why I find that US thinking is really not in the direction of confronting Iran's power projection, but more about minimizing or eliminating Iran's nuclear and ballistic threat. Okay. This is my view.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me turn to Ali. Actually, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Ali, just to take us quickly to Vienna, but please be short because I really want to hear you answer about something else as well. And the same question will go to Michael. Look, Ali Akbar Salehi, the head of the Iranian Atomic Energy Agency, has been out there, saying we are enriching to 5%, 20%, 60% more if need be. And we heard from the head of the IEA, Grossi, saying. Rafael Grossi, that only countries that are looking for a nuclear weapon at this level. Clearly, this is brinkmanship, but you've been following these nuclear talks quite closely. Is there any chance that this brinkmanship could damage the talks, or are the talks so set and on the path to eventually resulting in an agreement that you don't worry so much about the sort of chatter and the brinkmanship that I described?
Alex, very shortly, I don't think so. For me, the biggest evidence of political will on both sides to restore the JCPOA was the day after the most recent sabotage attack at Natanz, most likely by Israel, in which Iran obviously suffered a humiliation. But the day after, the Iranian delegation went to Vienna to resume negotiations. Despite the fact that they started enriching to 60% on that day, it also didn't stop the US delegation to go to Vienna and try to find a way forward.
Okay, so Ali, let me ask you something that Ambassador Rahim brought up, this idea of short-term policies of the United States, and the same question to Michael as well in a minute, and the sort of the Iranians that invest and they have depth behind their policy. I think Ambassador Rahim's talk about economic ties describes what Iran has done in Iraq in terms of integration, economic integration. We know integration is happening on different levels. But when you look at, because you follow Tehran, I guess, as much as any capital, what is the discussion like? The scenario that Ambassador Rahim just painted of it, potentially as a scenario, you have Iran being sort of, if you will, have Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon given to look after, and then the Israelis and the Gulf Arab states create their own bloc, which in itself is a huge question mark. But just say that happened. What would Iran do in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon? What is the appetite and ability to stay the course in those places? What do you hear in Tehran on those issues?
Alex, I think I have a fundamental problem with the framing of this issue. The reality is we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we want at the end of the day in our Iran policy? Yes, obviously we don't want Iran to dominate the region. And I would argue that there is a natural ceiling to Iranian influence in the region as well, because of just the sui generis nature of the state as a Shia nation surrounded by Sunnis, and as a Persian nation surrounded by Turks and Arabs. But yes, there is a ceiling to Iranian influence. But what's the floor? We have never been able to define an acceptable degree of influence of Iran in the region. Of course, Iran will have influence in Iraq. I mean, just look at the historic cultural ties between the two countries. How much Iranian influence can we accept, tolerate? Should it be really zero-sum between Iran and the GCC countries in terms of their influence in the Levant? You know, we have never been able to, neither us nor, by the way, the Gulf countries have been able to come up with reasonable answers to this question. Saudi Arabia's position for the longest time was no Iranian interference in Arab affairs. I mean, honestly, is that realistic in any way? And, you know, Michael talked about being a Russian optimist. They often say that a pessimist is a well-informed optimist. And in that sense, let me just say, you know, this argument about sanctions relief, about our approach to negotiations, these are all indicative of the fact that the first fix has to come, I would say, in terms of our own understanding and approach. If our dealing with Iran is still framed as giving them charity instead of giving them real sanctions relief or access to their own funds, because we don't want the IRGC to be able to benefit from it, we're basically arguing for the same things that the Trump administration argued, that we can't resolve our problems with Iran and give them sanctions relief unless we can resolve everything with Iran. And that's the formula for solving nothing, as we saw during the Trump administration. You can argue, yes, maybe 3 years of maximum pressure, 2.5 years was not enough. We need 20, 25 years. But I would suggest to you to look in other cases, like in North Korea, like in Cuba. There's often, sanctions work when you have very realistic objectives in mind, and they're narrow and achievable. But unfortunately, in the case of Iran and maximum pressure, they're not, unless, again, we can figure out a formula which is mutually tolerable for us and for them and for our allies in the region. Now, just one more thing on JCPOA Plus as well. I understand the ambassador's concerns, but look, if you were in the shoes of the Iranians, would you negotiate with a country that has already cheated on the one agreement you had with them and is now moving the goalposts and basically using a huge number of sanctions as a gun to your head to extract more concessions from you? So the whole idea around restoring the deal as it was is because without trust, regardless of the degree of leverage you have, you can't really negotiate with the other side. That's point number one. And point number two is, at the end of the day, we have to make sure that the Iranians will have incentives to negotiate a follow-on agreement. And the most important incentive is that the Iranians have realized that the deal is unstable. Yes, you can argue they want short-term reprieve, but the reality on the ground in Iran is the prospect of economic uncertainty, of this door of sanctions opening and closing every year and a half, creates so much unpredictability in the Iranian economy that it's even more damaging for the system, which realizes that it can survive under sanctions in the short run, for sure, but it cannot thrive under them in the medium run, and that threatens its survival in the medium to long run. And so I would argue, if we put a more for more or better for better arrangement on the nuclear front on the table, and I would even go a step further of saying a more consolidated Iranian state post inauguration in August would, I think, consider it seriously, because there is also benefit in it for them. Again, as long as we have this zero-sum mentality, I think we're stuck where we are.
Thank you, Ali. I know Ambassador Rahim wants to respond, but Ambassador, if you don't mind, if I could just go to Michael and I'll come back to you, if you don't mind, because I'm pretty sure that Michael also wants to respond to Ali. So Michael, go ahead, and if you want to respond to what you heard Ali say, and I actually do have a question from the audience that I want to pose to you. Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, well, first of all, Alex, in terms of your first question, where it actually differ in my answer from Ali is when it comes to the brinkmanship, I don't think we can only look at the audience being Vienna. What worries me about the brinkmanship in which Iran is now engaging is that it really becomes a poison pill for Congress. And ultimately, that's going to limit the life expectancy of any resulting deal unless any resulting deal can be ratified as a treaty by the US Congress. Make no mistake, the Congress is going to come up with ways to try to circumvent this renegotiation if they feel that they're being cut out and their concerns aren't being addressed. More broadly, where I disagree with Ali most strongly is in terms of, again, in terms of the IRGC. When it comes to the Iranian people benefiting from any deal, from any sanctions relief and so forth, the sad fact is with the current structure of the Iranian economy, ordinary Iranians are not benefiting. And it's in everyone's interest, if this deal is going to work, to see how that sanctions relief, the so-called Iranian money, actually goes to Iranians rather than just a short subset whose behavior is most problematic both against ordinary Iranians and within the region. I would just in quick response to Ambassador al-Rahim, when it comes, I mean, one of my jobs for the US Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth is to track the evolution of Iranian military rhetoric and to some degree political rhetoric. And one thing which we have seen is that where the Iranians once described themselves as a regional power, by around 2007, they started talking about themselves as a pan-regional power, by which they meant both the Persian Gulf and the Northern Indian Ocean. Starting around 2013, they defined, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, defined their strategic boundaries as the Eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf of Aden. Iran doesn't see itself just as a Shiite power, it sees itself as a Muslim power. And this is one of the common mistakes which I'd argue the US government makes, thinking that Iran's self-identity is solely Shiite rather than, more broadly speaking, Muslim. The last point I would make, and this again is in terms of what Rend al-Rahim said about spheres of influence and modus vivendi and so forth. The elephant in the room, and as Ren knows that I go back and forth to Iraq, not as frequently as she does, but I was just there about 3 or 4 weeks ago and I had brought my 8-year-old daughter with me who got into a bad habit of calling Hadi al-Amri rabbi to his face. But one of the key things about Iraq right now is that 44% of Iraqis have been born after the 2003 war. It may still be fresh memory for the American political class, but the Iraqis in many ways, society has fundamentally changed. One of the things I've been noticing over the last 4 years or so is the steady decline in the public display of religious figures, be they Shiite religious figures, be them Sunni religious figures, because ordinary people are no longer comparing their plight to what it was under Saddam. They're comparing the corruption and problems they face to the faults of the current Iraqi government. What I'm not sure whether the Iranians have fully taken this into account, as they, what I would argue generally, and Ambassador al-Rahim has heard me make this argument 15 years ago, is the Americans consistently underestimate the psychological impact of occupation. The Iranians consistently underestimate the psychological impact of Iraqi nationalism. And in this case, I would argue that one way in which the United States, if we had a little bit more diplomatic nuance, could contribute to the situation isn't just in terms of looking at this as hard power or overusing sanctions, as Ali says, but rather understanding that we can create other defenses that are completely nonviolent, that don't undercut the Iranian people in terms of helping the region defend itself against Iranian onslaught.
Thank you, Michael. If you don't mind, Michael, I will move over to Ambassador al-Rahim because I know she wanted to respond. Ambassador, please go ahead.
Well, really not respond, but comment on a couple of things that Ali said. By the way, Michael, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is why I said that allowing Iran, control, dominance in Iraq Lebanon and Syria will only appease Iran temporarily, because I doubt very much that Iran only sees itself in those terms. I think, as you put it very well, Iran sees itself as a pan-regional power. But going back to what Ali said, first of all, please don't misunderstand. I'm not arguing. I'm not saying that it should be JCPOA plus or nothing. I'm saying whatever is negotiated now, it is going to be extremely difficult to add to it later, as you suggest. It's not as if we can go back to the original JCPOA and presto, trust is established, and therefore we can add on pieces. I don't think Iran works that way. And I know you're an Iran specialist much more than I am, but from tracking them, they're not going to want to add pieces. They're not going to want to add the ballistic missiles if it's not done now. They're not going to, certainly not going to want to add issues about the IRCG or their influence. So it's not that I'm saying either do the JCPOA plus or don't do anything. I'm just saying once you do it, don't look any further. It's not going to happen. Okay, so whatever you want, ask for it now. The other thing is, you said, how much is the US, how much influence is the US willing to allow Iran in the region? Exactly the way I have tried to put it, in more delicate terms. You've put it in more delicate terms. What you're saying is that everybody should accept that Iran will have influence in the region. Our question should be, how much? Well, my answer is, there's no how much. Iran won't know the bit about how much. They will do it all, and that is what is likely, unless they're stopped from doing any. Okay? This question of calibration, I think, is a pipe dream. Okay. The other thing is the notion that, well, you know, Iran has always had influence in Iraq. No, Iran did not have influence in Iraq until 2003. Throughout, from 1921, we had until, 1980 or perhaps in the 70s, until the Iranian Revolution, Iraq had friendly relations with Iran. We had neighborly relations with Iran. Sometimes they were not very comfortable. After all, the Iranians negotiated with the Kurds, much to the Kurds' misfortune, but Iraq was willing to have Iran as the mediator, the negotiator. Iraq's relations with Iran were not relations of influence. They were relations of pari passu regional countries, neighbors. So the idea that, well, Iran has always had influence in Iraq, I think that is a fallacy that is often perpetrated in Washington. Now, are there some cultural ties? Sure, because of Shiism, because the Iranians come and visit the shrine cities, because some Iraqis, it used to be that Iranians used to come and study in Najaf and stay in Najaf. Now some Iraqis go to Qum and so on. But really, in terms of control, of penetration of the economy, of society, of policy, of decision-making, that never existed. And this is what we have today, unfortunately. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm going to go to Ali. Ali, please do react to the good ambassador. And I did have a question for you. Let me actually ask you my question so you can have both of them in one go. You talked about the sanctions and how hard it is for Iran to be able to plan long-term for its economy when it doesn't know if, in 4 years' time, there might be a new American president who'll bring sanctions back and so forth. But my question to you, Ali, is this. The Iranian economy and the problems it's had obviously predate the Trump administration or even the sanctions regime that sort of began in 2010-11. there are some structural issues in Iran that they need to fix. I mean, what's, again, to your mind, how ready are they to recognize that if you want to have a normal economy, you've got to make adjustments to your foreign policy beyond the nuclear issue? That it's the foreign policy, particularly non-relations to the United States, that is at the heart of it. Some Iranian officials openly admit to this. I mean, one individual, poor soul, who was just disqualified, Ali Motahari, when he was still in the running till the Guardian Council told him he can't run, he said so on Iranian TV that, look, 79, we got it wrong when we started this fight with the Americans, and we need to end it. So, I mean, I want to ask you, when you talk about the sanctions, yes, that one way of looking at it, but there is something more profound that needs to be addressed. And what do you think of that?
Alex, I think I don't want to get into a back and forth with my colleagues on this panel. Just to say we have to agree to disagree, but the reality is, even if we don't get into the history of relations between the two countries, and there's no doubt that Iranian influence after 2003 increased, no doubt about that. But the main person who was disqualified this week for running for office, Mr. Larijani, was actually born in Iraq. Ayatollah Sistani was born in Iran. I mean, there is just so much that we don't have time to get into. Yeah. But you see in what Ambassador said, and some of the logic is hard for me to understand, like, yes, we can't get a JCPOA plus in the future if we get into JCPOA plus, the JCPOA, the original deal now. But let's not get into the deal and negotiate a follow-on agreement that the Iranians are not going to agree to, which is the formula for not having a deal. Or zero Iranian influence is what we should be seeking, which is exactly what I said is at the core of this problem. But Alex, you're absolutely right. There is a need for fundamental rethink in Iran about their foreign policy, their enmity with Israel, which has no strategic explanation, logic to it whatsoever. This degree of animosity towards the United States, if I'm talking about US zero-sum mentality about Iran's role in the region, there are many in Tehran who, in mirror image, have the same view about the US's role in the region, and this is why we are stuck in this vicious cycle in the past 4 decades. The real question is, should the weaker party take the first step towards changing its strategic calculus, or is the onus on the stronger party? That's, I think, the main question that we have to try to address. And I think the Biden administration's approach is logical in the sense that let's address the most urgent issue, which is the nuclear issue. With it, restore a modicum of trust, then use that as a platform to continue negotiating on a nuclear issue. And then in parallel to that, and that's the lesson of the mistake that the Obama administration committed, which was to tackle the regional issues in a sequential manner. The Biden administration is doing that in a simultaneous way, and then trying to bring the regional countries together and have a regional dialogue in which all of these issues could be addressed. I mean, we cannot, I don't see how anybody thinks that's a reasonable approach. That at the time that we're selling billions of dollars of arms to Iran's neighbors, we turn around and tell the Iranians, oh, you have to disarm, you have to give away your ballistic missile program, which is your sole reliable conventional deterrent. I mean, it just doesn't work. But if we look at Iran's ballistic missile program as part of an arms control agreement in the region, then yes, there might be a chance of finding a way forward. Again, I'm not being starry-eyed about it, but I'm saying that kind of approach works much better than the kind of approach that Michael is talking about, which has been tried in the past 4 decades and has continuously failed. If our approach going forward is that our problem is primarily with Iranian enrichment and not with uranium enrichment, then we will be stuck in the outcome of the maximum pressure policy for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Ali. We have about 5 minutes left. So Michael, go ahead, react. And actually, before you react, Michael, let me read out 2 questions that I'm going to pose to you, but please others take them if you wish. One is the United States Congress and what role it has in all of this. You kind of hinted at it earlier. And the question is, if there's a new agreement, does the U.S. Congress have a say in this? And I guess if it's not going to be executive order, then it will have a say. And the other question, Michael, which is really interesting, is, how can China bail Iran out if there is no new deal? And to go back to Ali's point, Iran has kind of learned to live with the sanctions. He knows it's not going to thrive, but it's happy just to survive. Then China is the one player that can help it survive by buying just enough oil that the Iranian economy doesn't entirely tank. So, but is that a wild card, the role of China, particularly if we're thinking about this sort of new Cold War where you have China and Russia on one hand, the United States on the other? What on earth would China want to see the United States-Iran policy succeed? That is surely not in Beijing's interest. But please react to those points, Michael, and what you heard Ali say.
I'll accept Ali's spirit that we don't need to get into an endless back and forth. We can simply agree to disagree. In short, however, as I contradict what I just said, I would look at history in a slightly different way than Ali does. Ali might see a consistent failure of pressure campaigns where I'll see some success. For example, the price of isolation got to be so great on Iran that Iran ended up releasing the hostages in 1981. Likewise, while there had been some internal moves in Iran to end the Iran-Iraq war in 1982, it was only when the cost became so great that Ayatollah Khomeini reversed course. On the other hand, we had Klaus Kinkel, the German foreign minister, who back in 1993 inaugurated this idea of critical engagement. Between 1998 and 2005, this is during the time period of the so-called reformists, we had an almost tripling of European Union trade. We had a quintupling of the price of oil. And consistent with that was when Iran really developed its covert ballistic missile and covert enrichment program. Therefore, I would argue that unless you address the fact that money going into Iran has to benefit Iranians rather than be channeled into IRGC projects, we're actually going to be making the matter worse. I would also argue that we do need to make more of the fact that old agreements are enforced. It's not like there's no nuclear agreements with regard to Iran, even if we don't want to look at the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action because of Trump administration action. In 2005, the reason why initially the Iranian nuclear file was taken to the UN Security Council was because the IAEA found that Iran was in violation of its nuclear non-proliferation treaty safeguards agreement. I would argue that we do need to put much more pressure on Iran to actually ratify the additional protocol rather than only promise to adhere to it. When people say that the current Iranian nuclear deal or the JCPOA was foolproof, they're ignoring the fact that you have 140 plus countries which were members that had ratified the additional protocol, which were all subject to greater controls. I would also point out that in 1991, when South Africa wanted to come in from the cold with regard to its then covert nuclear program, it took the International Atomic Energy Agency 19 years, and this was the bulk of which was under Nelson Mandela to dot the I's and cross the T's in order to certify that South Africa was in complete compliance. I would argue that even the most optimistic reading of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action couldn't put the Khomeini regime on the same par as Nelson Mandela, just in terms of cooperation with inspections and so forth. With regard to China, I know many conservatives are a bit alarmist with regard to China-Iran dealing. I, for one, am not, simply because Iran has a long history of reaching out to third parties in order to bypass what they believe exploitation. Back in the 1850s, this was the Austro-Hungarians who built up the Dar al-Fanun. Then in the first decade of the 20th century, it was the Belgians. Once that relationship went awry with marches of death to Belgium in the streets of Tehran, no joking there. Then you had Morgan Schuster and the strangling of Persia. Later on, Arthur Milspow as the Americans got involved. It's in this same context that Iranians are reaching out to China. In Khorasan newspaper, there is actually a fascinating editorial whether Khomeini's rhetoric of neither East nor West, but Islamic Republic actually applied to China. The reason why I don't think China is going to work out is, first of all, the Iranian public is much more nationalistic than perhaps some of their leaders are in terms of reaching out to partnerships. At the same time, when you had all these discussions about what the 25-year China deal would be, part of which was leasing Quiche Island. Well, Quiche Island is, the center of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps activity. And the last thing you want is for, if you're Iranian or if you're the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is to be pushed out of the market by China. That's the best way to embrace resistance to the Chinese dealings. So what I suspect is happening, and I would agree with my colleague Wang Jiwei, that the Chinese are maneuvering, but they're not going to put money down in any serious way until they see that we have a much more permanent agreement. And frankly, what I do believe is necessary for a much more permanent agreement, at least on the United States part, is congressional ratification.
Thank you. You answered both questions. And the last word goes to Ambassador Rahim. Ambassador, about 10 years ago, I read that you described the challenges that, and I want to finish up here on Iraq. Maybe you can help us go in a hopeful direction. You described the three main challenges facing Iraq, and I hope I quote you right. One was Iraq remaining as a state, the future of Iraq as a democracy, and the future of Iraq as a functioning state. Would you agree at least that the US and Iran, of the 3 points you raised back then, agree that they both want to see Iraq as one state? And is that, I know it's a very small, hopeful sign to hang on to, but at least there is this Iranian-American understanding that they want to have Iraq stay intact. And perhaps that's something one can build on. But really what I'm asking you is, what in a best case scenario, because we know what the worst case scenario looks like. In a best case scenario, if Iran and the United States decided that, you know what, we're going to learn to accommodate each other in Iraq, how would that look like?
Well, we've already seen some kind of way in which Iraq has hosted Iranians and Saudis for secret talks. The Iraqis have also offered themselves as mediators with Iran on other issues. Look, I think the US and Iran both see it as in their interest for Iraq to remain as an integral state. I don't think that's really the issue. The issue is, to what extent is the US willing to allow Iran to exploit Iraq and to dominate Iraq? And of course, and it's easier to dominate if it's one country, by the way. I mean, it's against some Shia, etc., and the Kurds. So it's much easier than dealing with three governments and three states and what have you. So I don't think, and of course, President Biden, when he was senator and head of the Foreign Relations Committee, as you remember, had a non-binding resolution or suggestion that we should split up Iraq into a confederation. He did not say three states, but he said really it was more like a three-way confederation of Kurds, Sunnis, and Iraqis. And I wrote against that at the time, by the way. I hope now that I trust that as president, he's aware that this is a fairly unworkable solution on the ground and would be a disaster. So on that, at least Iran and the US can agree. Can they agree on anything more? The only thing that they should be agreeing on is that Iraq should have an independent, an ability to take independent decisions. That his decisions should not be dependent on the interests of Iran or indeed on the interests of the US, and that it should maintain good relations with the US, with Europe, with all its neighbors. But that Iranian influence, I mean, going again, I don't want to go back and forth. The protests in Iraq from 2019 until yesterday were by Shia. Mm-hmm. They were not by Sunnis. They were not by Kurds. They were by Shia against a Shia government. And one of the pillars of the grievances, one of the major grievances, was about Iranian influence in Iraq. Hence the burning of the consulates in Najaf, Karbala, Basra, and Nasiriyah, and so on. I mean, there is a groundswell of resentment against Iranian influence in Iraq, which people feel palpably in their lives every day. What the US and Iran should agree on is that Iraq should get on with its affairs on its own without undue meddling. Is that possible? I don't know. This is my optimistic final message. Really optimistic.
Let me just
not
say
Mike
that I
Upton,
wholeheartedly
optimistic.
agree with that.
And you
You
wholeheartedly.
do. I'm glad. At least we agree on something. We agree on much more than you imagine, by the way.
You know what? I'll take any optimism I get. And I'm sure Michael Rubin shares your optimism. So I'm afraid time is up. I want to thank Ambassador Rendell Rahim, Michael Rubin, and Ali Vaez. You've been wonderful. We've learned a lot from you. Thanks to the audience for all the questions. I apologize. I didn't get to every question that came out, but as you know, we only had about an hour. So thank you very much for joining us today. Again, thanks to our panelists for coming on and giving us their insights. We look forward to seeing you on